In this screencast, we are going to talk about how the heart pumps blood around the body.
And though you've learned a bit about the different types of circulation and systems and loops in the heart, we need to review a couple of key elements related to cellular respiration and ventilation. So, in cellular respiration, it is going to require oxygen and it needs to get rid of CO2. And this is why we need ventilation, which is breathing in, bringing in oxygen, and then breathing out, which gets rid of the CO2. But for ventilation to happen, we need something to carry the oxygen and the CO2 around the body. And blood does just that. Specifically, it is our red blood cells, which I'll abbreviate as RBCs. And these pump around, and to help the blood and the blood vessels move, we need our heart. You should hopefully know that. So this is our connection between ventilation and circulation. Circulation involves the heart and the arteries, and it will bring the oxygen that we get from breathing, and the blood itself will carry it around through the red blood cells, and then it will also carry waste back to the lungs to breathe out. Now let's look at a schematic of the heart. This is posted on Canvas, so please download it and label it as we go through the different parts of the heart right now. I know you're going to groan when you hear this, but you're going to need to ultimately remember this stuff. So here is a test question alert. Make sure you remember these and understand how blood flows through the heart. Okay, first thing to keep in mind is that when we're talking about the heart, sometimes people will mess up the sides that they're referring to. So you would think that over on this side, it would be the left side, but instead, this is actually the right side of the heart, and over here, this is actually our left side of the heart. It's important that you remember this as we go through because we'll be talking about different atriums and different ventricles, and when we do that, we need to make sure we label them as the right ventricle or the left ventricle. I'm going to go through labeling this pretty quickly, so please be sure to pause when you need to label at your leisure. Let's begin at the top, and we're focusing on this structure here that has 3 little channels coming off of it. And this is what we call, the aorta. Now moving over next to the aorta is something that we call the superior vena cava. And it pairs with a different structure, which when we zoom out, we can see down here at the bottom. This little section is what we call the inferior vena cava. So the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, they are paired together. Keep in mind that anything that brings blood back to the heart, that is what we call a vein. And anything that brings blood away from the heart is an artery. So now that we know that this and this, they're actually veins, our superior vena cava and our inferior vena cava, they are the largest veins in the body. So from them, blood comes from the rest of the body and then come through them into the heart via that superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. Moving on, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, they are going to both empty into what we call the right atrium. Let's zoom in. Then as the blood leaves the right atrium, it will flow through this area here, which is called the tricuspid valve. It's called the tricuspid valve because, even though you can't see it here, there actually are 3 sort of doors that are in between the right atrium and what's beneath. Now, beneath there, underneath the right atrium and the tricuspid valve, this is what we call our right ventricle. Notice that the right atrium is much smaller than the right ventricle. If we then follow the right ventricle upwards, it goes into a major artery, which will leave the heart. And we see that it actually splits into two, and this is what we call the pulmonary artery. So remember that one part of the pulmonary artery goes here underneath the aorta and the vena cava, and then we have a branch that goes over to the left side of the body. Now that we've started to look at these arteries, let's also look at some of these other things that are sticking off on the sides. And this, and this, these are what we call our pulmonary veins. I'm going to label that in purple just so that you can see where they all are. Okay, purple. And since I wrote that there were 4 pulmonary veins, let me just mark that we have our 2 pulmonary arteries. So the pulmonary veins, as we know, veins are going to bring blood back into the heart. And when we're saying that they are pulmonary, pulmonary is referring to the lungs. So it's bringing blood from the lungs to the heart. And then it will put it into the top right chamber, which is confusing, which is shown on the right of this diagram, but in fact we call it the left atrium. Beneath the left atrium, we have another valve that goes between there where the blood will flow down into the next ventricle, and we call this the bicuspid valve. Below the bicuspid valve, we then are emptying into the left ventricle. Now, I zoomed out a little bit because I want to focus on, outside of all of those compartments, the muscle that we see surrounding them. And it's important to notice that there are really muscular walls around the left ventricle. It's much thicker. The left ventricle's job requires it to be more powerful than the right ventricle. And just to continue and finish up with our labeling, blood will then leave the left ventricle, and it's a little hard to see, but it comes through here under the pulmonary artery to the aorta. And then the aorta will send it off. Now that we have all of the locations labeled in the heart, I now want to look at the flow of blood and how it moves through the heart. So let's insert in a blank version of that diagram. And we're going to use red to represent for us oxygenated blood. And then we're going to use blue arrows, and they're going to represent deoxygenated blood. So let's begin. We're going to start with our deoxygenated blood, which will flow into the right atrium, and it will come in from the superior vena cava and from the inferior vena cava. Keep in mind this inferior vena cava, it's a little difficult to imagine, but it kind of goes behind the heart and then empties in this section into the right atrium. From there, blood will travel through the tricuspid valve and then come into the right ventricle. The right ventricle, this bigger section in here, it will contract and it will push blood out in this direction. Show that with an arrow. Through the pulmonary arteries, which we know we have one branch there and another branch that goes under. Then, as the name implies, we're going to send it to the pulmonary section, right? Pulmonary means lungs. And at the lungs, the blood will be oxygenated, and it will also get rid of its CO2. Now that it's oxygenated blood, we can use our red arrows. The oxygenated blood then is going to come into our 4 different pulmonary veins, and it's a little hard to see, but this kind of travels behind and it empties out in here, and these 2 empty in as well. And they all will empty into the left atrium. Once the blood's in the left atrium from all 4 of the pulmonary veins, it will go through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, once it's in the left ventricle, it's going to leave. And so it's going to come up here, continue to travel. This again is, this whole thing is the aorta. So we have blood that's traveling to the aorta, and then after there, it will go to all areas of the body. Let's zoom out so you can see all of those arrows. Do keep in mind that we also have this small little section to the right of our inferior vena cava. And this little thing is actually also part of the aorta. So we can draw a red arrow coming out. This is where the aorta is descending. You can see it looping down this way to here. So again, from the left ventricle, it travels up to the aorta. There are 3 branches that come off, but you also have a section of the aorta that travels behind the heart and then out, and it empties out below the heart. This is descending to the lower parts of the body to bring the blood there. So besides knowing the labels of this diagram and knowing how blood flows, since I told you you should know that for your test, what are some takeaways from this general screencast? One of the most important things is that our oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, they are not mixing. So let's look back at our diagram, and you can see between this large chamber and this large chamber, there's a wall, and this wall is what we call the septum. And the septum is keeping the deoxygenated and the oxygenated blood separate. I think I've told some of you guys this, but when I was really young, I had something called an atrial septal defect. And it's a little hard to see under the aorta and the pulmonary arteries, but there actually is a septum that continues and keeps the right atrium separate from the left atrium. So think about this happening underneath the pulmonary artery, but what you see there in purple, there was a hole, and so instead you had mixing happening. We know that typically over here it is deoxygenated blood, but when we get to this side, to our left atrium, it has oxygen, and if you have some of that mixing happening, that's really bad, and your body has to work a lot harder to get the same amount of oxygen and get rid of the same amount of carbon dioxide as a normal individual. Other people have something called a ventricle septal defect, and so, or a VSD, meaning that the hole in their septum is right there, and so the mixing is happening from this chamber to this chamber. Another important thing to notice is where the muscle is located in the heart, right? So I'm sort of coloring it in here in purple. Okay, and where do we notice it being the thickest? Well, the septum is very thick, and again, this area that we have separating or surrounding our left ventricle has a lot of muscle. It has to move blood through the whole body, so it needs more muscle than, say, the right ventricle, which is only pumping blood to the lungs. And the last important thing that I want to mention is looking at the pattern of how a heart actually pumps. You may have heard the heart makes a sound that sort of sounds like lub-dub, and I want to explain that a bit. I'm going to try to insert a video here. Okay, this is going to be a little ghetto. I'm having some trouble inserting in a YouTube video, but let's see.
The normal heart has 2 sides, a right side and a left side, and 4 chambers, the top receiving chambers, or atrium, and the lower chambers, which are thick-walled pumping chambers, called ventricles. Red blood cell will come from either the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava and enter into the right atrium. The blood then flows across the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. The right ventricle then squeezes and ejects that blood cell into a vessel called the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery splits into 2 vessels, each going to the lungs. As that red blood cell makes its way through the lung, it returns through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium. That blood is now oxygenated. It's picked up oxygen, then goes across the mitral valve into the left ventricle, which does most of the work in terms of delivery of blood flow to the body. That blood cell is now ejected into the aorta to some organ or muscle or skin in the human body.